Hi, and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about Chapter 10. And actually, if you haven't already noticed in the syllabus, this won't be the only day we're talking about Chapter 10. It covers a lot of stuff. I guess all your chapters cover a lot of stuff, but this one covers a lot of stuff I want to talk about. So what I've decided to do is talk about some stuff that's more relevant to campaign development today, as far as the grand scheme of campaign development. And then what we'll do is all the little parts of your chapter that talk about specific theories that are used when we're trying to figure out how to develop the best messages for campaigns. We'll talk about those in a different part. Maybe two different parts. Anyway, so like I said, today we're going to be talking about general campaign design. What's the overall process for people who are campaign developers? I know most of you are technically not campaign developers yourself, but I might end up saying you a lot as if you are thinking about developing a campaign, because I would kind of like you to get thinking about how you would think about different problems in the development, or how you would think about approaching different issues for different audiences as we go through this. Anyway, I like that the book at the beginning of Chapter 10 uses the CDC's, if I can find it again, the CDC's criteria or steps, I guess you could say, for campaign development. It kind of mushes a lot into one, but it simplifies things. So I want to just start off going over that. So the first step, they say, is identify a health problem and determine whether communication should be part of the intervention. This seems a little bit obvious, but it was funny when I read that. The first thing that came to mind is a colleague that I work with and he also studies mass communication like I do, and we were debating about whether or not the CDC should be funding research on video game violence, video game playing in general, really. We sort of come from the school, well, not just me, that there's really very little research done on video games that is conclusive in any way about their effect on people's violent behavior, et cetera, et cetera. Very, very little. And so obviously we need more research, but the debate is whether or not the CDC should be the one to fund video game research, because if the CDC funds something, what does it automatically imply? That something's a public health problem, right? That this is a health problem that needs some sort of intervention. And I think that framing, just by virtue of the fact of the organization, just by virtue of the fact that an organization is funding it as a public health organization, could be a little problematic. But it is interesting because I think that is the stage that we're in right now. You don't see campaigns against video games, but one day we could. We're still trying to grapple with whether or not this is an actual health problem that needs to be addressed or not. The next step would be identify the audience for the communication problem and determine the best ways to reach them. This is super important. There are some things that might affect everybody, but even if there's some sort of health issue, environmental issue, perhaps like climate change, where you could say, oh, everybody in the population could potentially be affected by this, it's impossible to develop a message that's going to be effective to everybody in the population. It's going to be impossible to develop a message that can reach everybody in the population. So we need to do research to try to figure out what the most viable audience is for a particular message. Maybe we'll make that decision based on people's risk factor. Maybe we'll pick a population that's high at risk and try to target them. Or maybe we'll pick an audience that we think is going to be more receptive to the message and easier to get. Whatever the case is, a lot of research has to go in up front to determine what sort of audience is going to receive the message. And then of course we have to develop and test the communication concepts, messages, and materials with representatives of those target audiences. In other words, it's not as simple as just making some sort of campaign message. You also want to check and make sure that the audience that you have decided to target the message towards is going to be responding to it in the way that you want them to. Then the next step is implement the health communication program based on the results of the testing. In other words, if you need to tweak it, go ahead and tweak that message and then let it loose, right? Whatever the campaign strategy is, maybe it's a big mass communication strategy with commercials and radio spots and all those things, and first ladies doing something. I keep thinking about the red dress campaign with Laura Bush was very active in. Or it could just be flyers and brochures and things that are passed out, let's say, around campus or something like that. So whatever the scale is, you launch that program based on whatever research you've done beforehand. And then, finally, you want to assess how effectively the messages reach the target audience and modify the communication program if necessary. So at the end of the day, when all is said and done, you need to go back and actually check out if it worked or not. Was the campaign effective? Did the messages go where you thought they would go? And if not, what can be done in the future to sort of improve on that and make it so that similar campaigns meet more success. And I want to go ahead and I'll go ahead and introduce a little vocabulary right now. One of them is in the book and the other one's not. I hope that you see with those steps that there's a lot of research involved with a campaign. Again, to reiterate, it's not as simple as just, okay, picking an audience, making a message, and sending it out there, right? What needs to happen is at the very front, what we call formative research. Think about it as like formulating. Research on the audience, maybe through focus groups, or research about the audience, like which audience you're actually going to target. This all goes into development of the campaign. So you do this formative research up front to figure out what needs to actually go out and how you're going to send it out. And then this evaluation component at the end, assess how effectively the messages reach the target audience. And they don't say this, but also maybe how persuaded the audience was by the messages, would be what we call summative research, sort of giving a summary at the end to better understand the effectiveness of this campaign and hopefully future campaigns. Before we get into sort of the nitty-gritty of all those steps, I also wanted to point out that there are different goals for campaigns. Not all campaigns are created with the same goal. Some campaigns are created for awareness, right? They just want to raise awareness of health issues. And actually, your book doesn't mention this, but I happen to know that this is the thing that health campaigns are the best at raising awareness of issues that people might not even be thinking about. It's sort of another way of thinking about it is sort of setting a public agenda for thinking about things. So regardless of whether or not people are going to be washing their hands, let's say in the event of a flu outbreak, one of these like swine flu or bird flu, you might remember those things from a couple years ago. What the media was really good at and what different campaigns were really good at is making people aware that there was a problem, okay? You guys can probably think of some other awareness stuff more sort of recently, you know, a while ago there was on social media, there was an ALS bucket challenge where people would, have to say something about ALS, spread some sort of knowledge, and then either donate a small amount, either donate a large amount of money or donate a small amount of money. And if they took the small amount of money, they had to dump a bucket of ice water on their head, and then, you know, to keep the campaign going, they would challenge other people to do the same thing. I would argue that in spite of the fact that there is obviously the goal of raising money for that project, as far as this wasn't a health issue that where the campaign was trying to get to anybody to change behaviors, right? They were just trying to raise awareness of this disease, which of course is important for a variety of reasons, making people more willing to donate money, maybe has policy implications, those types of things. But point I want to make is not all campaigns are aimed at changing behavior. Some are though. I was mentioning the Red Dress campaign, but I think that's part of a larger Go Red campaign that was targeted towards maybe middle-aged women, I'd have to actually look into that, but who are high risk for heart disease. And this was about awareness, I'll give you that, right? I would say everything that is trying to get you to change a behavior is somewhat about awareness. But the campaign also focused on different lifestyle strategies that women could use to lower their risk for heart disease. They were trying to actually change women's behavior. So in that case, I'd say that campaign is definitely about behavior change. And finally, another goal would be public policy goals. So where maybe a campaign is launched to change public opinion, but it's not necessarily with the goal of getting the public to change any type of behavior. It's with the goal of trying to get the public to put pressure to have policy changes put in place. I actually can't think of a formal campaign with this goal, but what always comes to mind is different films that are developed. There's one right now, or circulating right now, about the food industry and some of the unhealthy things that come out of our food industry, and make some commentary on like the policies that make it possible. And I think that that would be the type of campaign that's aimed at getting the public to make different decisions that will eventually influence health policy. Anyway, with those goals in mind, right, that's going to change a lot of things. Awareness, behavior change, public policy, depending on what your goal is, that might change, for instance, who your audience is. So that's one thing to really think about at the get-go when you're doing formative research. And as we mentioned before, the first step in all this is going to be your audience analysis. Who is your audience? Remember, it can't be everyone. Everybody's just too broad. And then trying to figure out what do they like or what do they dislike. And this is where, I mean, the truth is market research does the exact same thing. In fact, some health research is called, some people call campaign research social marketing, right? Because what you're marketing really is some sort of like social behavior. It's not necessarily a product that you would pick up on the shelves, but it follows the same steps as basic marketing research. So what you're going to want to do is maybe take potential audience members and do interviews with them, or focus groups, which are really helpful because then audience members can talk back to one another. Maybe do even more general surveys to try to see how much a particular idea in your audience trends, those types of things. But then, even then, you might want to end up segmenting your audience. So for instance, let's say that, well, let's say this is near and dear to my heart. I used to do a lot of research on organ donation. Now, it could be that, you know, it's good to target college students for an organ donation message, because they tend to be the one, they have, it's kind of gross to say, fresh organs, right? They are the ones that, if they were, God forbid, in some sort of accident, and they were in a position to donate their organs, we would have a good chance of being able to reuse those organs for an organ donation situation. But here's the thing, a lot of my research and other people have been finding that college students are actually already pretty willing to donate, to become organ donors, or indicate those types of things on their driver's license, maybe even talk about it with their family. So making a whole campaign, you know, targeted at them doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Who really needs to be persuaded to become an organ donor still? Well, there's a couple different possibilities. One is people that maybe have some sort of that we can identify that maybe have some sort of fear around the process. As we've mentioned in other chapters, marginalized groups, particularly like minorities, African Americans, tend to really distrust the medical system because they've had terrible, terrible experiences in the past. And for this reason, they are more reticent to, you know, talk about becoming organ donors, or express willingness to become organ donors. This actually ends up being a huge problem because in order to find compatible organ donor matches, usually you need somebody of the same race and ethnicity. So this puts African Americans who need transplants in a bad situation because there aren't as many African Americans wanting to donate organs. This could make, for instance, African American, maybe younger adults, right? Because we need I feel so morbid. We need the fresh organs. But you get what I'm saying. That would be an example of how we want to, we have an audience, right, of people who are not organ donors, but then we even want to segment that further for the specific purpose. But it doesn't have to be based on demographics. It could also be on psychological factors. Your book mentions, for instance, that we know that people who are considered high sensation seekers, people that psychologically sort of have a need to engage in more risky behaviors, they like thrills, you know, they tend to have their own orientations towards health behaviors. And so that might be a particular group that if you can sort of identify them to begin with, if you can identify them to be up front, then you can have a better time tailoring your message towards them. So after that, right, the goal would be to create content for this particular group. We're going to talk extensively about different aspects that could be considered when developing messages from a theoretical standpoint. But one of the things your book makes a note of, which I think is important, is that whatever you do, right, it has to be something that captures people's attention and makes them remember it. And there's a couple formulaic things to keep in mind that you could use repetition, right? If you have a campaign message that shows up in different types of places, you hear it on the radio and you see it on TV, and you keep getting that message, that's one thing that could potentially help people remember and notice, to begin with, your campaign message. You need it to be vivid, something that catches people's attention to begin with, whether it's because of the coloring or the noise, those types of things. And of course, placement, right? It needs to be in a place where your target audience is going to see it. And more than perhaps remembering it, remembering it is the first part, right? It's kind of a prerequisite. But it also needs to be persuasive. And again, I'm just going to do another ... here, but we're going to be talking about how campaign designers use theory, use knowledge that we've developed over time about different patterns that we notice about how people respond to health messages, to figure out what type of message is going to be the best to use in a particular campaign. So one of my favorite examples, my master's thesis, actually the one on organ donation, was about this. Your book mentions prospect theory, and prospect theory has basically found that how you frame a message, whether you frame it in terms of losses, like what you'll lose if you don't do a healthy behavior, or gains, what you'll gain if you do a healthy behavior, can actually affect how receptive people are for that message. But it really depends on the behavior. So specifically, what research suggests is that if you frame a message for a high-risk behavior, something where people feel a lot of uncertainty about, or they have a lot to lose, for instance, screening behaviors. If I go and get if I do a self-breast exam, there's a risk that I could find a lump and that I could realize I have cancer. Same with prostate exams or any sort of screening behavior where what you could find out is very risky, right? For behaviors like that, it's better for messages to be framed as a loss. If you don't get screened for cancer, then these terrible things could happen. Whereas gain messages tend to work better for behaviors that don't have that sort of risk, in that actually where the main component is some sort of gain. So you could frame, for instance, you could frame like exercise as a loss. If you don't exercise, right, your body is going to like slowly die, or I don't know, whatever. Because again, that's something you'll lose if you don't exercise. But you could frame that as far as a gain and say, if you do exercise, you're going to feel better, you're going to look better, you're going to have do better on your checkups, all the things that you can gain. And again, because exercise or not exercising doesn't have that same risk factor, messages that are framed in the gain frame, not the loss frame, tend to be more persuasive for that particular type of behavior. That is just one example of how we can use a theory of message design to sort of understand the best way to make a message that's likely to be persuadable that's likely to persuade our audience. And finally, the last thing you really have to think of is message dissemination, targeting. How are you going to actually target that audience that you had already selected before? And by targeting, I mean, how are you going to match up some sort of mass media channel with your audience? It doesn't make sense, I say all the time, to design a campaign for college students, especially, let's say, West Virginia college students. West Virginia, like, college students on campus, let me put it like that, and target it at on like a local cable station, or have like a commercial on a local news station or something. They don't watch the news, right? That channel wouldn't match the audience, no matter how good the message is. Your book also brings up a great example of, if you know that you're targeting a message towards a group with low health literacy, then you're not going to want to make your message in something that's like heavily text-based, like a brochure or a flyer or something. You might do better with something that's a little bit more visual, maybe a magazine ad without a lot of text, or television or radio spots. Because again, it's about the qualities of those audience members. And for that reason, that's another reason why in that formative research that you do up front, when you're trying to figure out how you're actually going to make this campaign for your audience, some of the things you might want to know is what kind of media they use, what kind of media they're comfortable with, and maybe even do some pre-testing of different messages with different channels to see what really works. Okay, I think I covered all the basics, so now you have a very general idea of what to expect if you are ever asked to design a campaign. Again, we'll continue chapter 10 a little bit later and talk more about some specific theories that get used a lot in actual campaign development. So stay tuned.